Before we go any farther, make sure you have your blank copy of the page 6 notes that we'll be filling in along with this video. In this video, we're going to focus on 5 key questions. Why did England want colonies? Where were they? Who settled there? How were they set up? And did they make a profit? We're going to be focusing mainly on the early English colonies, and we'll get to the later colonies next week. So the English colonies are located right here on the east coast of present-day United States. You can see they're right along the Atlantic Ocean, and to the left across, or the west, across the Appalachian Mountains, this is where we've talked about New France, and we can see New Spain down in Florida, and we can see New Spain over here in the southwest and near Mexico. So why did England want colonies? Well, a lot of it had to do with a similar answer that we gave with the Spanish and French. England is looking to get rich, but England has some pretty unique problems that some of the other nations didn't have. England has what is called a balance of trade. Actually, all nations have a balance of trade. This is where nations are trying to balance their imports with their exports. Imports is what they bring into the country, so it's the amount of money as a whole the nation is spending. Exports is what the country has to sell to other countries. It's the amount of money they're making. So imports would be your spending, exports would be your earning. As we look at this, we can tell that England's was not balanced at all. And a big part of that has to do with the fact that the things England was importing, like spices and silks and really cool goods from the East, were very expensive. England was even buying really expensive things from other countries that had colonies like Spain. Sugarcane would be a great example. Unfortunately, what England has to sell is less than impressive. England has a lot of sheep. They're selling a lot of wool during this time period. And while wool are really cool, see the sunglasses, wool was not in super high demand, which meant they were not making a huge amount on the wool that they were selling, which meant that overall, England has a bad balance of trade. They are buying way more than they're selling, and as a result, they're going in debt. Take a second to fill in your notes. Pause if need be. So while England had economic reasons for wanting colonies, they need to fix that bad balance of trade so they're not way overspending what they're making. England also had some pretty serious religious issues going on. Right here, what we have is a church, and this church is an Anglican church. This church was created when King Henry VIII had an argument with Pope Gregory. King Henry VIII was on his multiple wife. He had married and divorced several, and he wanted another divorce. And King Gregory told him, no, the church, the Catholic Church, does not support divorce. You can't have another one. So what King Henry VIII decided to do was he decided to break the entire country, tell all of England that they were no longer part of the Catholic Church, and now instead they were going to be part of the Anglican Church, and that it was required for you to be a member of the Anglican Church. Now, not everyone in England was on board with King Henry's plan. They didn't agree with it, and many still wanted to practice the Catholic religion, or as years went on, many looked at the Anglican Church and felt that the way King Henry was running it wasn't quite right. However, with it being required, you got in trouble if you were not a member. You sometimes were taxed much heavier than those that were members of it, and sometimes you were put in jail or punished in other ways. Regardless, many people in England began yearning for some religious freedom and looking for a place that they could practice religion the way they believed religion should be practiced. Pause the video and take your notes. Along with the economic and the religious reasons, colonies offered England some really cool stuff. Colonies offered the possibility of fixing that balance of trade, of making things equal. So England over here, this tiny colony, or excuse me, this tiny country, could have colonies over in the New World, and from those colonies in the New World, England could get raw materials like copper, potentially gold, although England was never really successful in finding a lot of gold, fish, which could actually sell for a very high profit in the Old World in England, lumber, which was in short supply in England. Tobacco turns out to be a major cash crop in England. And so these goods, the colonies would be required to sell only to England. And they were required to sell them at a cheap price. So instead of England having to buy their raw materials from France, from Spain, from Portugal, they could get them from their own colonies kind of like direct from the manufacturer. In return, England would now have a place to sell some of their manufactured goods. Things like finished clothing, or even just finished fabric. China, plates, porcelain that was made in England, teapots, carriages, any of those things which were much more expensive. So England is purchasing really cheap raw materials from their colonies, and they are selling back really expensive finished goods to their colonies, which is going to balance out their trade so that the country of England is no longer losing money to other nations. Pause the video and catch up on your notes. Now, England's first colonies were actually created by what are called private investors. Those are people like you and me, just average people who are superbly rich, okay, maybe they're not so average, who can afford to pay for the funding of an entire colony. Basically, imagine if you were wealthy enough to fund an entire colony on Mars. That's kind of what we're talking about here. So the first colony, Roanoke, is funded by one family. And what ends up happening is they don't plan well, they don't bring enough supplies, their supply ships don't come back to help them out quick enough because they get stuck in England because there's a war going on in the Atlantic and they can't get over. And most of the settlers in Roanoke disappear. So Roanoke is considered the lost colony or the disappearing colony, and it's a failure. So the first successful colony is going to be Jamestown. Now, Jamestown, the English people learned something. They learned that one person or one family founding a colony wasn't going to be enough. Instead, what you need is what's called a joint stock company. And this is right here, company and joint. So it's a group of people we see here that are all going to pool their resources together to come up with enough money, enough ships, men, guns, whatever you're going to need to start the colony, to start a colony over in the New World with the intent on making a profit. In order to do this, though, they need a charter. They need written permission from the king at the time saying that they have a right to sail over here, set up a colony. Basically, the charter also gives the king a way to tax the people there so that the country of England can make money off of it. Now, initially when Jamestown was settled, the colonists and the joint stock company anticipated getting rich by finding gold. After all, that's how the Spanish did it. And yet, when they got there, they suffered and they had a really difficult time because there was no gold. And they spent so long looking for gold that they weren't prepared for the weather, they weren't prepared for the winter. And it really looked like the country of Jamestown was going to be another failure. Except we have Captain John Smith. Now, Captain John Smith was only in Jamestown for the first year, but he actually made a dramatic change. He really created what was a very simple rule: work or don't eat. Basically, if you didn't help the success of the colony by building, by farming, by gathering food, by cleaning water, whatever was necessary, you weren't going to get part of the food that the others had created. And so this limited people from just simply going on wild goose hunts looking for gold and really focusing on how are we going to get this colony to survive. Now, Captain John Smith also met some trade agreements with the local Native Americans, the Powhatans, to get corn and all that to help them through that first winter. There's some debate, depending on whether or not you look at English records or Native American records, whether or not this was a friendly venture or whether Captain John Smith demanded that the local natives give him the supplies necessary. What we do know is that at some point, Pocahontas, who's very famous for the Disney movie, but nothing about the Disney movie is true. We do know that Pocahontas, who was the daughter of the local Native American chief, was kidnapped. She was kept in the Jamestown colony, and eventually, at about the age 16, she was forced to marry John Rolfe. And the deal was she was going to remain a captive unless she married John Rolfe. And then, once she was married to John Rolfe, we know she converted to the Christian religion. Again, how willingly was that? We're not entirely sure. We do know that once she was kidnapped and in the Jamestown colony, she really didn't have much contact with her people. And so there's a very good chance that she felt like she had no option other than to convert to Christianity and marry Captain John Rolfe. That is an English portrait of Pocahontas, so we can see her dressed in English clothes. There really are no portraits of her dressed in Native American clothes, because the Joint Stock Company was working very hard to show people in England that they had civilized, they had tamed the Native Americans, and that this was a successful venture. Now, it's not until John Rolfe marries Pocahontas that the colony really begins to turn a profit. And the reason for that is Pocahontas' family, her Native American tribe, the Powhatan, knew about tobacco. And they knew how to cure and dry tobacco into a substance that could be sold in England, where it became all the rage and insanely popular. And so tobacco is going to become the #1 cash crop of the Jamestown colony. Pause the video and fill in your notes. Now, one of the things that makes Jamestown unique, other than being the first successful English colony where everyone doesn't either disappear or die, is the fact that Jamestown has what was called the House of Burgesses. Initially, the Joint Stock Company was having trouble getting people to move to Jamestown. It was far, it was remote, it was dangerous. And so what they do is they offer an elected assembly. They basically offer self-government. And they tell people who move there, if you move there, if you own land, you can vote and you can elect your own representatives, and those representatives can make local laws. This was actually pretty revolutionary for your average person who might only own a tiny plot of land to have a say in the government, in something that didn't exist in great portions of England. So the House of Burgesses is absolutely huge for being the first elected government in the New World. Now remember, we said people came to the New World, or the English wanted colonies, for two main reasons. One had to do with fixing a financial problem or making a profit. The other one had to do with religious issues. The first group to come over to the English colonies because of religious reasons we call the Pilgrims, but they were actually what we call separatists. These were people who believed that the only way to actually fix what was going on in the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, was to leave the church, be separate, to start all over again. Now, they had intended and had permission to land in Jamestown. So when they leave England, they bring enough supplies with them to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, but they're expecting to land in an established colony that already has a system of government. What ends up happening is a huge storm blows them off course, and they land up in Plymouth, which is in present-day Massachusetts, much farther north, much colder, and of course, they land in the fall. So they know winter is coming, they know things are dangerous, they've got a couple of decisions. They can try and get back on the boat, they can try and find this colony of Jamestown, but they're not entirely sure where they are. So they decide to stay put and build their colony there. But one of the big problems is they don't have a government. And so before they even get off the boat, they create what's called the Mayflower Compact, which seemingly is very simple, but it's very revolutionary in what it says. So to begin with, they recognize they didn't land where they were supposed to. And they're already kind of troublemakers because they said, we don't want to be part of the Church of England. So right away in this Mayflower Compact, they pledged their loyalty to England. They say they are loyal to the king and that they are establishing a colony on behalf of the king. But then the other part they do is they say that they all agree, truthfully meaning all men agree, Women didn't really have much legal say. They all agreed to make laws together and obey them. So they're setting up a different type of government, where in Jamestown you chose representatives to go make the laws for you. The Mayflower Compact creates what's called a direct democracy. Every man in each town directly could go to a town meeting, could be part of the conversation about the local laws, and could vote on every law. And this worked pretty well in the New England colonies, and especially in the towns, because initially they're small. So we see that next step in this idea of the colonies, that people should have a say, that they should have self-government. Okay, pause the video and get your notes, or listen while I talk about, here's Squanto supposedly helping the colonists. He is the one, along with Samoset right here, who taught them how to farm, taught them how to use dead fish as fertilizer for corn. The relationship between the local natives and the Pilgrims will start out good. It's going to turn sour pretty quickly as the English feel they are entitled to the resources around them and begin just taking from the Native Americans, claiming more and more land, and just shoving the Native Americans out of the way. Okay, if you don't have all the notes at this point, definitely pause. I'm going on to the next slide. So the other group that we need to learn about that came over for religious freedom actually settles in a very similar area. They settled just north of Plymouth in Massachusetts Bay, and they call it the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, these are our Puritans. These are people who believed in the Anglican Church, but believed that there were some problems with it, that it needed to be cleaned up, that it needed to be a little bit stricter. And so they came over wanting to establish a community based on religion, based on the Bible. They were very focused on education. In fact, everyone was required to learn to read, and that was so that you could learn to read the Bible, so that you could learn a proper life. They also believe in self-government. Their colony is going to end up being bigger, so they're going to have elected representatives. And what we see clearly here is a continuation of this idea that adult men can vote if you own land. Now, both the Pilgrims and the Puritans, while they came over here looking for religious freedom, do not offer it to anyone else. If you live in Plymouth or you live in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you must follow their religion. And if you don't, you're punished. So, if you still want religious freedom and you don't believe in what the Puritans are saying and you don't believe in what the Pilgrims are saying, basically what would happen is you would get kicked out of one of those two colonies if you were living in the New World. And so what we see happening is we see Connecticut, we see Rhode Island, we see New Hampshire, all being formed around this idea of offering true religious freedom. So Rhode Island is the next colony, and it is the first one that offers true religious freedom. Anybody can practice any religion in Rhode Island. Okay, if you haven't finished up your notes, make sure you finish them up before you close out the video. It would also be a good idea to go back to that very first screen I showed you. I'll flip back there now. And can you answer these questions? Why did England want colonies? Where were they? Who settled there? How were they set up? How was their government set up? And how did they make a profit? Or for some colonies, was making a profit even really the goal?